to Online Travel Talks. And today I'm delighted to say that we have Simon McNamara from IATA with us today. He is the UK and Ireland country manager for IATA. And we're going to be talking about everything aviation and what's going on at the moment. And there's quite a lot going on in the whole aviation world for sure. So welcome, Simon.
Thanks, Julia.
So let's first of all perhaps get stuck in and, how do you feel the recovery is going? I think I can kind of just about say that because I know that this first quarter hasn't been too bad. We are definitely seeing signs of recovery in terms of bookings and appetite to get going again and travel. Are you kind of seeing that yourself at IATA and the airlines that you represent?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I'm sure we'll come on to it in a minute, but the whole Russia-Ukraine thing is, it's a terrible human tragedy, and that's going to have an impact on travel as well. But if we set that aside for 1 minute and focus on recovery from COVID, it is very positive. We're starting to see many countries removing restrictions, particularly in Europe and North America. Asia Pacific is still very, very restricted, but in much of Europe, the restrictions are starting to be lifted and bookings are coming back. We just issued a global forecast last week in terms of where we think traffic's going, and we're expecting traffic globally to be recovered to pre-pandemic levels by 2024 now. And within Europe, the same, full recovery by 2024, which is only 2 years away. Bearing in mind, we're now still only at about 50%. So bookings are strong, people's confidence is strong. So it is a positive outlook. It is a positive outlook, we think. Very
good. And do you sort of think, because obviously you talk a lot more to government than many of us would do, whether or not does it feel a bit more sure-footed? We've had this kind of yo-yo of, okay, restrictions off, no restrictions back. Are you beginning to sense that this is something that we can rely upon a bit more?
I think so. And I think, what we've seen, particularly in Europe, we've seen a number of countries completely remove their border restrictions in the last few weeks, really. Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, most recently Ireland, in fact, last Sunday removed all its border restrictions. And I think governments wouldn't do that. Obviously, we're encouraging them to, but governments wouldn't do that if they weren't confident that we're in a phase of the pandemic where actually border restrictions don't make a difference. And I think that the big difference we saw was Omicron, where it became really apparent that the border restrictions had no impact at all, because by the time it was picked up in the country, it was already, by the time the border measures were put in, the virus was already in the country. So actually the border measures were doing nothing apart from discouraging travel. And we know that has a massive economic damage. So I think that was the sort of defining moment for some of those countries. And I think they are sure-footed now. We see it here in the UK where we're both sitting, is that, all the domestic restrictions have gone. So actually it makes no sense to have travel restrictions either. So I think governments are much surer now, much surer.
Yes, that's good. I think the other thing that Omicron tested was the vaccines.
Correct.
And so although, it kind of raged through the countries, it seems that the vaccines pretty much held up.
Exactly.
So I think that was also makes everyone feel a bit more confident, enough for even Australia, the shyest, not completely of all, because Asia's had a terrible time altogether.
Yeah.
But,
I think that's a fair point, Julia, is there are parts of the world, I was sitting here in Europe, it's still very much open. There are parts of the world where it is still quite restrictive.
Indeed.
And those markets are going to take longer. The obvious one is the Asia Pacific region, but as you rightly say, even they are starting to look at reopening New Zealand, Australia, and so on.
Yes, I think everyone's kind of looking to Australia, seeing how that goes. Even New Zealand is going, okay, I think we'll have a go at it as well. And I think that starts to encourage Asia more specifically to begin to relax borders. But of course, now moving on to, one crisis at a time, Simon.
Terrible.
Now moving on to the next crisis is that, obviously the problem with Ukraine and the terrible invasion and the atrocities that are now happening, but come from an aviation perspective, it's a no-fly zone, essentially. So what does that mean? So we kind of go round left or right, and this means longer trips. What's your take on all?
Obviously, the first thing to say is obviously, the sort of events you're seeing on TV are terrible, and that's a huge geopolitical event that I guess we don't want to get into here because it's sort of above our pay grade. But I mean, it is a terrible tragedy, the human migration and so on. But from an aviation perspective, yeah, we're seeing the immediate impact was the airspace ban, obviously, which many countries, 40+ countries, have now imposed on Russian airlines, and obviously the reciprocal means that they can't overfly Russia. That mainly affects flows from, in our case, from Europe to Asia, because a lot of them use Russian airspace to overfly to get there. So what in practice it means for the time being is longer routings. So you have to go around it, and it is possible with extra fuel, maybe less payload, sometimes without any impact on payload. So it is having an impact because traffic is quite reduced to the Asia Pacific region anyway because of COVID. It's not as big an operational impact as it probably would have been, right. But it's not exactly as if airlines wanted to have to deal with that right now. I think the sort of more medium-term impacts are what we don't know. We see already a massive impact on oil price, and that has a major driver for airlines in terms of their costs. So that's an uncertainty. Yeah. What the conflict is going to do for consumer sentiment on travel, will that dent the recovery that we were just talking about? What we do know is that previously, when we've had geopolitical shocks like this, they would have had a massive impact on the sector. Yeah. And had we have not had the last 2 years of COVID, this is all we'd have been talking about. We would have never had the previous chat we had about positivity. It would have all been negative. There's a kind of weariness over the last 2 years of thinking, okay, what more can be thrown at this sector, whether it's travel or airlines? And I think they'll find a way around it. But at the moment, that uncertainty is unknown. But what we do know is it will have an impact on the sector in those areas I mentioned, mainly consumer confidence, fuel price, more than anything else.
Yes, it's sort of, the industry's got extremely good at adapting because it has to, of course.
Exactly.
But what you're saying is because we're now at the beginning of a recovery for Asia, and now we have obviously the airspace to contend with. Does this mean then they literally start writing new routes that other, because they can, and you're stopping in different locations, which might be interesting?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think many airlines have had to introduce fueling stops yet, but some, depending on their networks, they might have to. But yeah, essentially, that if you're going from Europe, you'll either take a southerly route or you'll take an extremely northerly route. And if you look at, for example, Finnair is a good example that has introduced a new, very northerly route to get down to Asia. And if you look at the Western European airlines in France, Germany, and so on, they're tending to go south. And obviously over the Middle East and kind of other areas. So there are operational ways around it. It's less than ideal for an airline though, because it adds extra fuel, it adds complexity. And when you're just coming into recovery, that's something you don't really want, you don't need. So
yes, yeah, absolutely. So sort of this flexibility and trying to sort of look at how you're going to put together new routes and so on. And planes going further sort of brings me a little bit onto sustainability, because I know that planes are going further and they're getting more efficient. And in 2019, I went to quite a lot of plane parties, to sort of aviation parties of new launches of aircraft, and everyone was quite proud of how efficient that new generation of aircraft was. But of course, the push is now to get even more efficient than the 2019 wave of new aircraft that was ordered. And so what is happening in that whole space with Boeing and Airbus? Are they really building furiously sort of more economic?
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole topic of sustainability is something that even through the worst period of the pandemic, when the industry was basically shut down, people couldn't travel. Government didn't let go of the sustainability agenda. And for the sector itself, it's a huge challenge. It's probably our biggest strategic constraint, is making sure we can grow green and have a license to grow despite what we do. So actually within IATA, our airlines, our global membership of airlines made a commitment last October to be net zero by 2050. And it's actually the only global transport sector to have done that. Now, there's a number of building blocks in getting there. It's not something you achieve overnight, and it's not just technology. Technology is a key part in terms of new aircraft and new things, but a really big building block of it is sustainable fuels. The focus at the moment is making sure that actually the production of sustainable fuels can be ramped up sufficiently to deliver the fuel we need to grow, because the technology will change. There's potential, particularly on short haul, for electric. There's talk of hydrogen, but the current fleet of aircraft is still going to be flying for some years. So sustainable aviation fuels, or SAF, gives us the sort of ability to grow. So in order to meet that 2050 target, there's an awful lot of work now, and we're lobbying governments as well to ramp up sustainable fuel production, because the airline sector, the travel sector, we can't do it on our own. We need other people to help support that effort to get to that target of net zero by 2050.
Yes, and you need airports that are also stocking sustainable fuel for refueling. And so maybe just as a basic, explain what actually is SAF, a sustainable aviation fuel. What actually constitute?
It is basically, it's a fuel that's been manufactured from an alternative to fossil fuels. So you take the constituent ingredients or whatever it might be, even waste can be converted into fuel. And I think it's really important.
Hang on, what human waste?
No, sorry, as in garbage.
Garbage waste. Okay, well, I was just checking.
Yeah. Banana skins, So it's basically, I think it's really important to point out here is that what we're not talking about, and there was a big debate about that, taking grain, taking food, and turning it into fuel. So we're not doing that. We're looking at the latest generation of fuels that use alternative algae and other such things to basically, in a plant, to make the fuel. The fuel is then blended with conventional jet fuel. So it basically, the stuff that goes into the aircraft.
It's like a mix.
Exactly right. It's a blend. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, it's a blend of conventional fuel and sustainable fuel. And what we're looking to do is, up that mix so you get more sustainable fuel, less conventional fuel. But in terms of the way the sustainable fuel behaves, it behaves in exactly the same way as conventional fossil-based fuels do. The only difference is that it's basically zero carbon, because it hasn't extracted carbon from the air.
Oh, interesting. And which countries are making sustainable fuel?
So there's in fact many countries around the world are actually looking into it now. So there's a number of companies that are kind of leading the charge, but it requires investment by governments in R&D, in physical plants to make the stuff. So we're very much encouraging governments to give tax breaks to these private companies who are going to produce this fuel, and incentivize them to set up, whether it's in the UK or Germany or France, set up production plants that start to deliver the sort of percentages of SAF that we need, because it's a key building block for achieving that 2050 target.
Wow, that's very interesting. Well, OTT has a sustainability category, which has just gone live, and we're inviting many of our partners to put their sustainability initiatives together in very sort of short e-learning courses, typically sort of one lesson. And we've got Lufthansa they're in build, so that we should see their course very soon, and also Cathay Pacific, which is interesting. But I thought maybe IATA, if you have, I know your time must be very precious, but I happily invite IATA to send us updates or to create a short course if you wish.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's as I said, it's a huge challenge for this sector in the long term. Setting aside everything we've spoken about, geopolitical events, pandemics, the license to grow is something that we shouldn't take for granted. And for this industry to grow and for people to be able to travel, we're going to need, a plan and a strategy. And we think this commitment to net zero by 2050 for the airlines, at least, is a big one.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's a big discussion, and there's lots of misinformation out there as well. And there are also lots of consumers asking probably is going to get trickier questions. So the industry needs to be educated just on things like what actually is SAF and how does it mix. And, so your information today is really, really helpful. But we need to know more. So that's really what our category is all about, the education on that side of it. But that's good.
Yeah, so, there's a big education piece to be done, actually, because you're right, the aviation has bad PR when it comes to climate. People look out the window, they go to an airport, they see an aircraft, it looks pretty much like it looked 30 years ago. But the difference is that the aircraft that you're getting on, the Boeing 787 or the A350 is consuming 50% less fuel per passenger than it did 30 years ago, but people can't see that. So we have to do the job of explaining the progress the industry's made on that much better.
Absolutely, that's good. So just general sort of to end on this really interesting talk, and we'd love to have you back as well as the year progresses, but just to sort of end on where you see the recovery moving now with just how everything is going. I know it's obviously still uncertain with what's happening in the Ukraine, but yeah, just generally your predictions, if you like.
Yes, I mean, as I said, we're expecting traffic globally to be back to pre-pandemic levels by 2024.
Okay.
So if you look at that, that's a global figure. Mm-hmm. If I was to generalize, you'll see that recovery coming quicker in Europe, North America, and slower in Asia Pacific.
Yeah.
But globally, back to pre-pandemic levels by 2024, which is actually, when you think about it, the pandemic started 2 years ago. We were talking about 4 or 5 year impact to this. So it will, in the grand scheme of things, be a 4 to 5 year impact overall. Yeah. But the positive thing is it's coming back, and the industry has a pretty solid future beyond that, we think.
Well, that is positive news indeed, and that's really, we know we're on our way, I think. At least we're hoping to feel that we are on our way, and I think you've definitely helped build some confidence into that feeling. I think so long as governments continue to move forward and aren't kind of changing things, then I think everyone will really get behind that recovery.
And I think, your question on how sure are you of governments? Well, I'd never take a strong bet on it, because our governments they have a nice habit of U-turning and changing their minds. But I think we're surer than we've ever been they're not going to go backwards. The big uncertainty is future variants of concern. Yeah. And if another one arrives, how is that managed? So that is the one cloud on the horizon we're keeping an eye on. IATA's lobbying governments around the world on that to say you need to do a more pragmatic approach to it in the future. So that's the one issue that we're just keeping a sort of future eye on to see where that goes.
But the worst of the turbulence, ha ha ha.
Yeah, exactly. It's hopefully
behind us, seems to be in control. Yeah,
exactly. So,
excellent. Get ready for landing.
That's right, Julia.
Brilliant, or taking off, I should say, really. Brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much for joining us today, Simon, and I hope to pick up with you again later in the year. And wishing IATA all the best with the recovery as we move forward.
Brilliant. Thanks, Julia.